Welcome back. Now that I've talked a little about the new Vyond Island, let's dive deeper into this fictional world by discussing the geography of this island. Using my own knowledge of geography, I will talk about the 5 main themes. Physical geography, that's the environment, including nature, weather, and climates. Population and settlement, including birth and death rates as well as migration. Cultural coherence and diversity, I'll explain the different cultures of this world, including languages and religions. Geopolitical framework, this is mainly talking about politics, government, and warfare. And finally, economic and social development, this refers to the stability of each area of the world, socially and economically. Alright, let's start with the physical geography. Since this is a small-scale version of the real world, you may assume that most of the countries have about the same climate. But this is not the case for Vyond Island. The climates on Vyond Island are based on climates in the real world, including tropical, temperate, and polar. Around the equator it gets hot and rainy year-round, it's mostly tropical. As you move further north or south, it starts to get dry, with less rainfall, but it's still hot year-round, these are desert climates. Then you'll get into a more temperate climate, which alternates between hot and cold temperatures for different seasons depending on the hemisphere. Then it starts to get colder the further north or south you go, and eventually you'll reach areas of tundra and ice. Each of the climates and environment match those in the real world. For example, countries in North Africa and Southwest Asia are mainly areas of desert, while over in northern Scandinavia you'll experience more areas of tundra, especially in Iceland. And in South and Southeast Asia it's more tropical with excessive rainfall and extremely high temperatures, especially in India. Elevation plays a role in physical geography too, this includes mountains and volcanoes. The areas in red represent higher elevation, and the areas in green represent lower elevation. The mountains and volcanoes are not nearly as tall as they are in the real world, since Vyond Island is much smaller than the real world. They do exist though, and they're still pretty tall. A lot of countries are separated by mountains, especially in Europe. That's why so many languages exist in Europe. All those mountains have separated people for thousands of years, and over time they've started developing their own languages, which we will talk about later. But now let's move on to population and settlement. The population is pretty easy to explain. There are currently 659 residents on Vyond Island, so it's easy to keep track of every one of them. And the population changes like in the real world, but not nearly as frequently. Births will refer to the introductions of new residents on Vyond, regardless if they're adults or children, while deaths refer to the discontinuation of support for these residents. I'm pretty sure entire categories of text-to-speech residents used to be on Vyond Island, including Loquendo, Neo-Speech, and Nuance, but that's likely from the old Vyond Island. Here we're discussing the new Vyond Island. Now, as you saw in my video discussing the new Vyond Island, there are different populations for each country, with the United States being the most populous. But because there are widely varying sizes for each country in terms of area, population density plays a vital role in population and settlement. Here is a map of population density in the real world. The more people per area, the higher the population density. In the real world, China and India have around 1.4 billion people, but India has less physical area than China, so India has a higher population density. But on Vyond Island, there are far fewer people with different rankings for population from the real world, and therefore, population density differs considerably. When it comes to population pyramids, usually this refers to the separation of different age groups and genders for one particular country. But on this island it's a bit different. Here the population pyramids only have 2 age groups, adults and minors, and there's still a separation of genders. But because there are only 2 age groups, it won't really be much of a pyramid. So instead of using one country for a population pyramid, we'll be using all of the countries from one region of the world, and they'll be in the order of descending adult population, so it's really more of an upside-down pyramid. Here is an example of a population pyramid for East Asia. Not very many people as you can see. And usually population pyramids determine the level of development in a country. Pyramids with a wider base are less developed than pyramids with a narrow base and wider center. But here, the population has nothing to do with development, even though some countries are more developed than others. I will talk more about that when we get to economic and social development. As for settlement, the idea of migration, including immigration and emigration, isn't really present on Vyond Island. All residents stay in the same place. They have no interest in immigrating to other countries or emigrating from their own countries. However, they may still visit other countries. Now let's talk about cultural coherence and diversity. As is true in the real world, different areas of the world on Vyond Island have different cultures, including religions, languages, music, food, and more. The language concept is pretty easy to explain. Residents in different countries speak different languages. But since there are very few residents on Vyond Island, it is likely that each country will speak only one language and practice only one religion, and only a handful of residents speak more than one language. India has at least 10 languages, but despite that, Hinduism is still the main religion, and on Vyond Island, almost all residents of India practice Hinduism. For almost every country in North Africa and Southwest Asia, all residents speak Arabic and practice Islam. Israel is an exception, where all the residents speak Hebrew and practice Judaism. Overall, there are many varying languages and religions on Vyond Island. In the history of the real world, these languages and religions have spread from their countries of origin. But on Vyond Island, the idea of spreading cultures isn't really relevant. They've pretty much always existed in specific areas, since Vyond Island isn't a real place and I've only recently started talking about it. That's why explaining the geography of a fictional place and basing its concepts on the real world is a bit difficult for me. But now let's move on to geopolitical framework. Of course, countries in the real world wouldn't be what they are today if not for all those wars and conflicts. But in Vyond Island, these concepts aren't really present. Everyone lives in peace. There are no wars, especially with very few people in each country. Residents have no interest in colonizing other inhabited countries or settling into any uninhabited land. Basically, there's as little interference between countries as possible. And there isn't much need for a government if a country has very few residents, since there's hardly anyone to look down upon or take care of. There will still be a government system for most countries though, including a leader. The levels of democracy in each country are not nearly as varied as they are in the real world due to minimal residency on Vyond Island. In a democracy, the citizens get to vote on a leader for their country. This includes most countries in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. But China is more authoritarian, that's all I'm gonna say about it. For multilingual countries like India and South Africa, leadership can be pretty difficult due to most residents not speaking a second language, despite some of the languages being in the same language class. And let's also talk about dependencies, which are lands that are overseen by other countries. On Vyond Island, only 2 dependencies are inhabited. Hong Kong is a dependency of China, and Puerto Rico is a dependency of the United States. In the history of the real world, Hong Kong was governed by Great Britain until 1997, when that government was transferred to China. And Puerto Rico was governed by Spain until 1898, following the Spanish-American War, and then the US took control of the land. But again, on Vyond Island, there isn't any global history or wars since Vyond Island is pretty new. And finally, economic and social development. Some regions in Vyond Island are more economically developed than others. North America, Europe, and Oceania are the main regions of economic prosperity, while Sub-Saharan Africa has significant economic struggles. And it will likely stay that way due to minimal interference between countries. But money shouldn't be too much of an issue since there aren't many people to try and mess with the global economy. The idea of social development includes such topics as gender equality and education. Some countries and regions are better educated than others, but again, with very few residents in each country, and with most countries having an equal number of female and male residents, the topic of gender equality or inequality isn't really present on Vyond Island. There's hardly any sexism or racism on the island too. Awesome, right? But again, this place isn't real, and in the real world, all of these issues have caused trouble for almost everyone. So I hope I explained everything well enough. Geography is all around us, and Vyond Island is no exception, so I thought I could incorporate my passion for geography into this fictional place. Think about how geography plays a role where you live. Perhaps your insight can help me gain more knowledge of how your area of the world works in Vyond Island. For anyone studying geography or exploring the world right now, best wishes on your journey, and I hope to see y'all again soon. This is Felix, over and out.